Welcome, everyone. Everyone is here, Sean?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, to this roundtable on rethinking property in Canada. My name is Catherine Parrer. I work in the Center for Studies in Arts and Culture at Brock University. I am happy to introduce our guests. Adrian Blackwell, artist and professor at the University of Waterloo. David Fortin, architect and professor at Laurentian University. Adrian and David will moderate the conversation. With them are Bonnie Devine, artist, founding chair of the Indigenous Visual Culture Program at OCAD and 2021 winner of the Governor General Award in Visual and Media Arts. Luugigyoo Patrick Reid Stewart, architect in British Columbia and chair of the Indigenous Task Force for the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and Tiffany Kaewen, landscape architect, currently a PhD student in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Co-organizer of this event is Derek Knight, professor in visual arts at Brock University. We acknowledge the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon, One Spoon agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. We also welcome artist Bernard Cella from the Salon für Kunstbuch, for the Salon for Artist Book in Vienna, Austria, who will work with us to prepare an online publication following this event. Today's roundtable brings together Indigenous and settler artists, architects, and urbanists who will share their perspectives on how property could be rethought in order to reimagine the form and structure of Canadian cities. Questions will be taken at the end of our session through the Q&A function only. But for the moment, it is to Adrian. Adrian, your turn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Catherine and Derek for organizing this, and to David, Bonnie, Tiffany, and Patrick for joining us today. I'm gonna share my screen. My name is Adrian Blackwell, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Toronto on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. My father's family comes from Peterborough, and his grandparents immigrated to Canada from England and from Massachusetts, where some of our ancestors were early colonists. My mother was born in Austria and grew up in challenging times there and moved to Canada as an adult. Both my parents completed graduate degrees at university, and I did the same, and now I teach in a university. So as I engage in work about property in Canada, I do it from a settler immigrant perspective, and I'm working to unsettle the comfort of this inheritance. Toronto sits within the lands negotiated with Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I work at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture in Cambridge, Ontario, which sits within the Haldimand Tract. which is the right image on the screen. Land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. These are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And many Indigenous people live in these areas today. A few years ago, I organized a lecture at Waterloo by Mohawk land claims researcher Phil Montour. He presented his research over 40 years with the Six Nations Land and Resources Office and his own firm, Native Lands, on the historical division of land in the Haldimand Tract, which was granted to the Six Nations in 1784. I was struck by this work trying to understand the history of Indigenous land dispossession down to individual lots within cities such as Brantford and Caledonia, which resonated, strangely, with architectural studies that began in the 1970s by people like George Baird at the University of Waterloo and Melvin Charney at the Université de Montréal into the relationships between property division and architectural typology and urban morphology. This superficial coincidence of images points to a deeper problem and a connection. The process of settler land delineation, homesteading, and dispossession are processes that underlie modern forms of property and land, but also the forms of urbanization and settlement in Canada and the pathologies that haunt the spaces of Canada. So this issue, which is number 12 and 13 of the journal Scapegoat, Architecture, Landscape, Political Economy, that David and I embarked on as a research project, was initiated in order to try to connect architectural thinking about urban and architectural form to processes of colonization, to address the continuities between past and present, and to think about how this practice of city making can be rethought to make space in a different way. It's been a real pleasure working with David on this project. I've learned so much from his research, his perceptions of architecture and property, and his attention to collaboration. So it's been great to work on this over now quite a few years, and we're eager to get this out. It says it's already out, and it does physically exist, at least in a PDF form, digital PDF form. I don't know whether that's physical or not, but it will be posted on the Scapegoat Journal website this week, and it will be available in a hard copy by the end of the year or early next year. It's still in printing. We thought about this through a couple of lenses. One of them was this question of delineation. So as architects, both David and I are interested in the problem of drawing and the way that architects draw things in advance. And we were struck by this idea that Sandra Matsadra and Brett Nielsen raise about the modern world being produced through three kinds of delineations, three kinds of lines. The lines of nation states in Europe, the lines of colonial conquest outside of Europe, and what were called the enclosures, which was a kind of turning back of these lines onto Europe itself to rethink private property. So we're interested in the way these three kinds of lines are imbricated together. The title of the journal, which is taken from Luugigyoo Patrick Reid Stewart's work, it's Canada with a set of backslashes between each of the letters to illustrate a kind of the violence of division. At least that's how, one of the ways that David and I understand it, that has marked Canada as a settlement area. And its subtitle is Delineating Nation-State Capitalism. And I think we're interested in these three things: the nation, the state, and capitalism, and the way in which they all cause problems, and that these lines in some ways are foundations for these different forms of these different structures, or what Kojin Karatani would call different forms of exchange. Nation exchanges, state exchanges, and capitalist exchanges. And he says that he thinks that nation exchanges are about fraternity in some way. And I think he thinks in that way about even, and especially maybe First Nations, having exchanges of reciprocity. States, at least the first states, monarchical states, exchange through plunder and redistribution. And capitalism exchanges through commodity exchange. But for Karatani, these three states are bound together. These three historical modes of exchange are bound together. And I think we understand this delineation as a kind of composite that builds these different forms of exchange into one system that needs to be changed and dismantled to create what Kojun Karatani would say a new form of exchange that's again based in reciprocity. I'm worried I might be already at time here, but I want to move quickly. We thought a little bit about, wait, did I miss something? Yeah, we thought a little bit about the way colonialism is important in world history around this question of property, because property was not something that was made in Europe or invented in Europe. This modern idea of property was constructed through the colonial process. It was constructed through Europeans meeting indigenous people and developing new magical ideas about land, which were in large part misguided interpretations, or in part at least were founded on misguided interpretations of indigenous land. And these two books I think are quite interesting in thinking about this co-creation of property as a modern exchangeable form in different colonial contexts. Brenna Bandar and Alan Greer's books. So we're interested in the way the fiction of settler fee simple property, with its exclusive ownership, its full alienability, its infinite monopolization, and its open availability to specific people, white men of means, as something which comes out of this encounter between feudal property and pre-colonial indigenous, especially maybe Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee land relations, not especially, but maybe those are the ones that we maybe looked at in a little more detail in the journal issue, which is why we call them out especially. So the journal issue has three parts. I don't think I can mention all of the contributors. We are showing a few pages from it, and it's designed by Jack Henry Fisher and John Crone, who are both part of Other Forms, which is our publisher based in Chicago. So it has, the issue has three sections. The first one, colonial land appropriation founds the laws and spaces of our nation. Sorry, it's hard to read this, but that's part of our graphic style. And there are a number of pieces in this section. One of them by Angela Victoria Freeman and Martha Stegman looks specifically at the Toronto Purchase and explains the formation of the city as an inequitable exchange. The second section is called "The Lot is the Basic Unit of Urban Morphology and Architectural Typology." And in this section, Irina Latek and George Baird and a few other people who have been thinking about this problem of the way property forms the basis of architectural typology and urban morphology, described that idea. And in this piece, Roberto Damiani and Michael Piper look at Southern Ontario and the process of land division over time, and looking at some of the systems of land division that go from the lot to larger, that the lot in a way is a function of subdivision of initial and larger divisions of land that are part of colonial dispossession. So they're trying to kind of connect colonial land dispossession to the form of the city. And I think one of the things that we also came upon, especially through Phil Montour's work, is that the process of dispossession both works from grand delineations, like the delineation of large parcels that get subdivided into smaller parcels, but it also is formed the other way through homesteading and individual constructions on the land, which then get formalized into land. And so this double movement, both from the concession block down, but also from the lot upwards, are part of this process. And the final section, Decolonization Multiplies Our Relationship to Land, has different examples that start to maybe open up new possibilities for land. And Patrick's work and Bonnie's work are both in this section. I should have said that Tiffany's work is in the first section of the journal. And this is a work by Danny Castilian-Longlade that looks at Georgian Bay and the interactions between especially Métis land practices and settler land practices on the Bay. So thanks. I think I might have run over. I hope I'm not setting a bad precedent. But I'm really happy to pass this to David Fortin.
Thanks, Adrian. All right, I'm going to jump right into it here. Let me just find my screen to share. So thanks, Adrian. And I would just also echo Adrian's sentiments that it's been a real pleasure, a long journey at this issue, because this is a really deep topic, I think, and it's going to take many more years for me to fully get my head around it. I want to just run through a few thoughts that leads up to this for me and my interest in this when we first started talking about this. And, you know, I realized at some point that almost all of my academic interests really come down to issues of boundary. And that's just something that's kind of been realized for me over the last number of years. But going to Heidegger and thinking about building dwelling thinking, there are these two conditions of boundary, the root word being bound, which is quite fascinating to me, because the first one is like sort of being fastened or tied down to something. You know, you bind someone when you need to restrain them. And the other one is actually the one where it comes to dwell. So, you know, you're bound to go, you're bound to succeed. And they're interrelated. So there's this kind of interesting relationship between this concept of needing to be delineated in order to bound forward. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but there's something about this notion of boundary that is essential human condition, not just human. But how one perceives that boundary is quite different. The subjective experience of boundary and its relationship to the world. So the image on the left is a diagram that I drew a number of years ago now for, sorry, there should be a caption on there. Okay, it's not there. I drew that for a housing project that I coordinated. You know, and Leroy Littlebear kind of explains this, that the earth cannot be separated from the actual being of Indians. And yet on the other side is this strange concept where one interprets the land and dividing up the land as one that owns part of my private property. So my identity gets tied to what I own. And an elder that I worked on another project, that's in a conversation with her, she had said this, you know, I never really understand how anyone could think they own anything. Do they think they own the trees or the birds or the insects as well? So there's this kind of strange schism between two kind of ways to think about the land and boundary and identity. Oh, there it is. There's the diagram. So I was born in Calgary, and this has always been an interesting map for me in a sense. The Tsuut'ina Nation is on the southwest corner of Calgary. And the city is kind of encroached on it. And for those of you not familiar with Calgary, you probably already know, but this is a city that generates its wealth primarily from resource extraction. But when you take the Google area off of the map, the land itself is different. So you have this kind of urbanizing resource extraction city meeting this line between First Nation and the city, which is quite remarkable. And if we look historically at Canada, I came across this in my research at some point in my own, as a citizen of the Métis Nation. I've been doing a lot of research into Métis architecture, and this township map is quite fascinating because within it, this is for historical purposes, the site of the Batoche Rebellion, the resistance of the Métis people. And it's one of the last armed battles in Canadian history. And you can see that there are three different strategies of land division here. On the bottom right, there is no land division, it's the reserve. In the center are the Métis river lot systems, which are based on egalitarian access to water and to roads, and then the Dominion grid. So all three of them converge at this moment where there was armed conflict over property and land. Just to share a few examples how this kind of has, as we've been working through this, we've also had projects come to us. This is a project that we just found out today got funded for 3 of these houses. I'm excited. This is at Whitefish Lake First Nation in Alberta. And the division of the land was already there when we arrived on the project, so that was kind of already planned out in this typical suburban form. But, I was questioning the boundary on the lot. And so you can see, in a sense, the houses ignore the lots. They all face south, so we can get as much passive solar into those houses. And then we looked at the property line as an opportunity for shared driveways. And then the next property line, the idea of planting berries along that, so bring community together on the property line. So from a design perspective, it's been quite interesting to see how the property line has impacted things. And then lastly, I just wanted to share, this is a kind of series of projects that I'm involved with on Capitol Hill, but the orange area in the bottom is a gifted project to the Indigenous peoples from the Government of Canada for their new Indigenous people space. And I won't go into the details of this other than say when we arrived onto this project with the Assembly of First Nations, myself, Wanda Della Costa, and Eladia Smoke, and our teams, Jason and Larissa, and our elder Winnie Pinawataquit, there was this hard line drawn around our scope. And we found that quite interesting, that here we were being told what we can and can't do based on the property lines on unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation for probably the most prominent project ever in Canadian history. And we were given this context where, it's a heritage building, so you're not allowed to touch the building. And this was something someone had sketched this at some point, saying, you get to indigenize this, which is sort of in the back alley up to a certain level. And that's the voice of Indigenous people in Ottawa because of property lines and development. So we obviously pushed back and exploded that. We didn't make too many friends, but we ignored all of that, went way out of scope, and tried to ask ourselves how we could celebrate Indigenous peoples, throw the boundaries and the property lines away. So thank you for sharing these experiences, and I think I'm going to pass it off now to Tiffany.
Did you say me? Is it my turn? Okay. Just share my screen. Cool. Okay. Thank you to Adrian, David, Katrin for hosting this event, and also to Patrick and Bonnie for being part of the conversation later. My name is Tiffany Kaewen Dang. I'm a landscape architect and a landscape scholar. I'm joining today from Cambridge, UK, where I've been living for the past few years, working on finishing my PhD at the university here. I just want to extend a quick acknowledgement to Treaty 6 territory, where I was born and raised in the settler city of Edmonton. Although I haven't lived there for a number of years, the vast majority of my research and design work continues to be informed by those lands. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. The contribution that I have to this issue is called Grids and Parks, Two Sides of an Extractive Worldview. This piece comes out of work that I did for my master's thesis in landscape architecture a couple of years ago. So as a born and raised Albertan, I always had a complicated relationship with the extraction industry. So when it came time to do my master's thesis, I knew I wanted to look at the landscapes of extraction. But while I was doing this research on extractivism in Canada, I came to realize or learn that the colonial ideologies which really drive the resource extraction industry in Canada could actually be applied to the formation of the national parks system. And I thought that as a landscape architect, that was quite compelling. And also nature in Canada, or at least in settler Canada, is always perceived as sort of banal space of like fun recreational space. and this dark colonial history is often overlooked. As I dug deeper, I started to recognize the hand of landscape architecture and also architects in designing the landscapes of the national parks in order to make them appear as wilderness spaces or as wild. So yeah, that's how I got into this research. I think I'm just going to give a quick run through of like the main points. I don't know. Yeah. So to start with parks, the first superintendent of the first national park of Canada, which is Banff National Park, which is really close to Calgary, was a Dominion land surveyor named George Stewart. He was sent there to survey the land and sort of delineate the borders for the park after Canadian Pacific Railway workers discovered a series of hot springs in the area. And in his first annual report, he significantly stated that the local Stoney First Nations people needed to be excluded from the park as they were spending too much time there and damaging the landscape through hunting and foraging, etc. Fast forward to 1970, the Parks Department of Canada, under the purview of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, led by then Minister of Indian Affairs Jean Chrétien, who later became the Prime Minister of Canada in the 90s, initiated a planning document called the National Parks Systems Plan. And this document divided the nation into 39 natural regions. And the goal was to establish at least one park in each region. And in essence, this plan, in my view, is a explicit declaration that the parks are going to be used to sort of colonize every corner of the nation. And yes, the national park system now becomes an infrastructure of territorial delineation and control. The delineation of the first national park in Banff in 1886 was preceded by the Dominion Lands Survey, which was initiated to systemically map the Canadian prairies and therefore prepare the land for settlement. The maps produced by the DLS served as sort of ledgers of settlement, tracking the progress of settlement across the prairies. I feel like I'm echoing what David said, but the township grid is like a 6 mile by 6 mile grid, which is sort of subdivided into smaller pieces, which then can be parceled out to settlers. As the land survey moved westward to settle the land, the settlers followed, arriving by train. So in parallel with the Dominion Land Survey was the construction of the Transcontinental Railway, and then also the 11 numbered treaties, which followed very closely the progression of the railway in order to clear land to build the railway. The treaties were meant to appropriate land for the Canadian settler state from Indigenous nations and displace Indigenous peoples into reserves. And the numbered treaties spanned 1871 to 1929. And this systemically pushed Indigenous peoples into reserves and concentrated settler settlement into towns and cities. And so these systems, the railway, the survey, and then the treaties sort of form this triad of, I guess, regulatory infrastructures which establish a sort of spatialized settler hegemony, which persists today, which pits sort of settler spaces against Indigenous spaces, and also urban spaces against non-urban spaces. And so the spatial logic of colonialism, which persists at the expense or prioritizes settler cities at the expense of sacrificial, so-called sacrificial hinterlands. This is a very like prevalent sort of reading in urban theory today. I argue that this relationship can be applied to the landscape of the national parks, which can be seen as extending the settler occupation of land into non-urban spaces and thereby perpetuating Indigenous erasure and dispossession, which we can trace back to the establishment of the first park in 1886. Interestingly, I think I forgot to mention this, but George Stewart, who was the land surveyor who was sent to Banff to delineate the borders of the park, in the House of Commons debate where they announced that they're going to hire him, they actually referred to him as a landscape architect. And as far as I've been able to tell, this is one of the earliest uses of the term landscape architect in Canada. So I think it's very telling that the profession of landscape architecture actually stems directly from these sort of dispossessive practices of land delineation. So I don't know, I feel like I don't have that much more to say, but let's see. Yeah, resource exploitation and construction of wilderness and national parks are two sides of the same strategic worldview. And I feel like one of the most visible ways that we see this today in sort of Canadian settler spaces is in the formulation of a Canadian national, so-called national identity. There's no doubt that Canada is a resource empire, especially out west where I'm from. But at the same time, settler Canadians also place extremely high value on the preservation of spaces of untouched nature in the national parks, and they take great pride in that as well. And so there's this sort of seeming paradox of loving natural spaces, meanwhile promoting resource extraction. But actually, if you dig into the root of it, they both stem from this exact same sort of colonial ideology. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tiffany. I think we're going to go to Bonnie next.
Thank you very much. I feel very happy to be involved in this panel. I'm an Anishinaabe woman from Serpent River First Nation on the North Shore of Lake Huron, but grew up mostly in Toronto. Certainly got my my education in Toronto, and I live and work in Toronto now. The way I'm going to approach my presentation today is to show you some of my recent work and how it relates to this idea of property. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try and do this effectively. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to start with a work that I made in two sessions in 2014 and 2015. This piece is called Battle for the Woodlands, and it was installed in situ at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I was responding to a colonial map, which you may see on the right upper side of the image. The map depicts Upper and Lower Canada, and it was made in 1832. And this particular map had dominated this area of the gallery for a decade or so. My intention was to reimagine and remap the Great Lakes as Indigenous glyphs in red paint and delineate with a beaded belt, and you may just see those lines surrounding the Great Lakes, the boundaries of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, by which the King of England, George III, had designated a gigantic swath of North America as an Indian territory by the stroke of a pen. 3 years later, in 2018, I was again considering land and notions of ownership, which the British call title, and came across this document. It's a facsimile reproduction of the indenture to the Toronto Purchase, dated 1805, by which the British Crown purchased 250,830 acres of land on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, the principal site of modern-day Toronto. For this piece of land, they paid 10 shillings. The Mississaugas, obviously misunderstanding the meaning of the word title, reserved for themselves the right to exclusively fish on Etobicoke Creek. This treaty is now known as Treaty 13. As a member of, not the Mississauga, but of the Anishinaabe Nation, I feel compelled to acknowledge the signatories of this treaty by name. They were Chichak, Kwereparan, Wabukanye, Kemapenase, Wabanase, Canabonesense, Othnego, and Achetan. I explored these ideas, this misunderstanding of the word title, in a number of projects over the years. One of them was a project at the Art Gallery of Mississauga in 2018 called Circles and Lines, Michitsagik. Michitsagik is the Anishinaabe word for Mississauga. And I found it interesting earlier when Adrian was talking about lines as one of the key tropes, I suppose, of colonial abstraction when thinking about place. This image here is the starting point of the exhibition. It's a mixed media diptych in acrylic on board called Titled, Untitled. My thought was to observe European and Anishinaabe representations of land. The left panel is a map of urban Mississauga, Ontario, including the shoreline of Lake Ontario. I was particularly interested in the way the land has been abstracted and is gridded off and divided into parcels or lots. The right panel is my memory of Indigenous marks called petroglyphs that are carved into the rock at Burleigh Falls, Ontario on Mississauga territory at the southern verge of the Precambrian Shield. These marks on the rock are mnemonic symbols to stimulate teaching via narrative recall. So very, very different use of marks. This image, also from the exhibition Circles and Lines, Michitsagik, is called Harbor. The left panel is a depth chart of the Toronto Harbor surveyed in July and August of 1881 by the cartographer Joseph Charles of Tache and Écoutez. The intention was to calculate the commercial shipping viability of the Toronto Harbor. On the right, my glyph of the Toronto Island, pictured as a recumbent being. This image, also from that same exhibition, is called North Shore Line. Again, it's a mixed media diptych in acrylics on board. On the left is a reproduction of a property line map from 1805, as drawn by Surveyor General Charles Burton Wyatt. It is a sketch of a further tract of land purchased from the Mississauga Indians, now known as Treaty 22. On February 8th, 1820, according to the terms of Treaty 22, the Mississaugas acquiesced to the Crown and ceded their lands at 12th and 16th Mile Creek, along with northern and southern portions of the Credit River Reserve. Treaty 23, negotiated later that same day, saw the central portion of the Credit River Reserve, along with its woods and waters, ceded to the Crown for £50. On the right, my depiction of a small river and lake-bound homeland. The horizontal lines represent zones of habitation for plants, animals, and human beings. And finally, this diptych, it's called Impassable. The left panel is an 1867 reconnaissance map of the country between the rivers Humber and Etobicoke, from the shore of Lake Ontario to Dundas Street in the north. The cartographer, H.J.W. Gill, indicates areas of military vulnerability to a potential land attack. His chart shows stretches that are heavily wooded and areas of marshy lowlands that could be easily defended in the event of an attack on the city of Toronto. The right panel shows a stand of trees, in this case, maples, interlacing themselves in kinship patterns at the level of their roots. In the same exhibition, I installed this series of objects at the entrance to the gallery. The piece is called Borderline Border Braid and consists of an antique surveyor's transit and tripod and a length of braided red cotton cloth. The appearance on their land of a team of surveyors was often the first sign of threat to Indigenous people. Notice how the transit resembles a weapon. In fact, it is a weapon whose aim is to precisely and implacably demarcate and ultimately possess the land. And finally, my last slide, this object. It's 16 feet in diameter and is made of reeds I gathered in an area of low-lying land at the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, some 30 kilometers from the city of Mississauga. I carried these reeds to the art gallery at Mississauga City Center on August 31st, 2018, and braided them there. It's called Circle of Inquiry for a Dish with One Spoon, and recalls the agreement between the Indigenous nations of the woodlands surrounding the Great Lakes to share the land and its bounty in peace among themselves. In a stroke of irony or fortune, unknown to myself at the time, the gallery where this work was placed lies directly below the Mississauga City Hall Council Chambers. And I guess that's all I have to say today. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. And Patrick, would you like to present next?
Patrick, you may be muted. I'm not sure if you're talking or not, but we're not hearing anything.
You're right. Sorry about that. I didn't unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. I want to acknowledge the traditional unceded territory of the Chilkowiak peoples on whose stolen land I live, work, and play, and I'm speaking from today. Sumigaget, Siganam Hanak, Kuwoltsik, Luugigyoo, Niskani, Wobdakani, and I'm having trouble controlling my computer. Here we go. Kicking goal, Luam Kodam, Hugasam. So I am very pleased to be here. I refer to this country in which I live as /Canada. The backward slash is considered wrong grammatically. It's analogous to the wrongness of this country and its treatment of Indigenous peoples, and is a daily reminder to me of the injustices in the country within which I live. So, reminding me that I can never stop resisting, protesting, working. So this was from my dissertation. This is where my family is from, up in the Nass River in northwestern BC, right near Alaska. So the international boundary between the US and Canada went right through our territory. And so we have family on both sides of the border. And that star in the upper left one and the arrow in the right one is Hidden Inlet, Alaska, is where my mom grew up. And she was raised there after she came back from residential school. this is the village that her family's from, and she was sent from here as a 5-year-old down to where I currently live, which is kind of ironic, in Chilliwack. Kokolitsa Residential School was located there, and it was church-based. So it was a Methodist missionary that was up here in the Nass, and the school in Kokolitsa was a Methodist school, and that's where kids from our village were sent. The surveyor showed up here in 1885 and started to survey the land, at which time the Nisgat took great exception and tried to prevent it, but to no avail. And we were dispossessed of our land. And the word on the right there, Angosk, this is the Angosk of Wilpdakin. I'm a member of Wilpdakin, which is a killer whale house. And Dakin is our chief, and Angosk is the land that belongs to his name. And it covers a big territory here. One of the things that I see my work as, trauma-informed architecture as a catalyst for change, because there's been nothing but, change, I guess, that we've been subjected to. On the left is a village that's about to be burned down, and all the people were sent away. And this was a photograph from that time as they were departing the village, one of the last boats out. And one of the things that the colonizers always thought is that we prayed to our totems, and which wasn't the case. But the picture on the right is they transported us to residential school, where, lo and behold, what are we praying to? And the devastation to our territories is this kind of settlement patterns. This is a reserve in the east of Canada, and what we've been subjected to for the last hundreds of years is the onslaught of colonization. But in reality, when I'm working, this is where I take my inspiration. This is a spiritual site in one of the First Nations that I'm currently working in, and that's where we're focusing. And this is we're looking at the historic development of the land that the nation has inhabited for 9,000 years. So sorry, I thought I've turned all the sound off. But this site predates the pyramids by 4,500 years, and the colonizers came and dispossessed, and by force took the land, and it's still happening. So there's 700 youth in care, in foster care, in the province of BC that age out every year, but there's no resources for them. Half of them end up homeless. So one of the projects that we worked on was this Aboriginal children's village, where it was a project for kids in care. The difference here, if you're familiar with foster care, the difference here is the units were assigned to the children, not to the adults. So if a foster family broke down, it wasn't the child that was removed as typical. It was the parents that were removed, and the child got to age in place. And that was something that, one way of trying to, I guess, resist. And when we look at the work that we do, and the image on the right is breathing life into the building. This was at the grand opening, and he's using eagle down, and the elements on the principles on the left are what guide the work that I do. And yeah, it's ongoing, and David's familiar with these. We have tried to do some of the work on our own. So we have put publications together. These are international publications with participation from Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia. And these are all Indigenous authors in here. And we just thought that now's the time to be doing it for ourselves. Our Voices on the left came out in 2018. Our Voices 2 came out this year in 2021, and we have our Voices 3 coming out. We're working on now. So I would just, like to say that, in our architecture, may we acknowledge the sacred, acknowledge the process, the ceremony as architecture, and see architecture as ceremony, as process, as sacred. And with that, I say Toik Stinas and thank you. Did I do it under 5? Sorry,
Close enough.
it was
Close
a whirlwind.
Great. Well, we'll jump right to questions, I think. Adrian?
Yeah, that sounds good. Do you want to go first, David?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So a bit of a setup question, this one, but bear with me, and then I'll kind of summarize it. So this first question that I have is directed mainly to Tiffany and Bonnie. In 1955, the French theorist Guy Debord defined what he called psychogeography, which is the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So he famously cut up a map of Paris, for those of you that might not know, and basically reorganized those bits and pieces of the map to make a difference between the kind of cartography and the everyday experience of somebody. It seems to me that both the grid in Tiffany's case and the painting are ultimately about abstract expressions of relationships with land, but the flow is reversed. So when Bonnie is painting the land, she's using her creative mind to reinterpret and communicate that land in one direction. And in the other direction is kind of a political ideology that goes through the creative mind and is then applied on the land. So I guess the question is, I thought, in relation to this terms that Debord uses on the emotions, this has deep impact on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. And so I thought maybe you could just each speak a little bit more about the relationship between our creative minds and the land, and why you think there's such a vastly different abstraction of it. Like, can you tease that out a little bit more?
Shall I start, Tiffany? Yes, I totally agree that both sides of the diptychs that I'm working with are abstractions. Part of what I was very interested in was the fact that Indigenous people are often denied the ability to think abstractly, or at least when I was growing up, that's what I was taught. We were too stupid to be able to extrapolate from the real. And I wanted to counter that with a series of my own abstractions. And so in some ways, it was a rebuttal of a colonial myth about the picture making abilities of Indigenous people and the ability of Indigenous people to think theoretically about land and so on. But I think there is something more utilitarian than that, and this is what we would call in Anishinaabe the purpose of art. And the purpose of art ultimately is not to create decorative objects, not to create monetizable commodities or collectibles. The purpose of art is much more intrinsic to the society, and it has to do in part, and I'm not going to go through everything that art is to Anishinaabe people, but one of the key roles of art to Anishinaabe people is to teach. to pass on knowledge and to inscribe a certain knowledge so that it can be remembered and reenacted, reperformed. And so I was very interested in the way that maybe maps do that too. Maybe maps actually have a similar role in the construction of Western culture, which is to teach, to perhaps school in a way of thinking or inscribe a certain ideology within a population. And that ideology within Western culture, I would argue, is possession. The notion that we actually can, in a way, in the same way that George III of England drew a line on a map and said, okay, this will belong to this person and that will belong to that person. The way that he saw it, that the power of that inscription on a piece of paper gave him, I think, is colossally psychotic. And I wanted to underline that yes, there is a psychogeography, and yes, it can be decoded in the marks that we make about the land. And how do we try to define and discern for ourselves within our own practices healthier ways, more sane ways, perhaps, if sane isn't too constructed a adjective, but in more humane ways, possibly, a way of describing place. And that's where I was coming from with that. Now, I don't know if I've answered your question, David, but anyway, that's what I have to offer.
Wow, thank you. I think that's a great answer. Tiffany?
Yeah, I think I'm echoing some of the same things. I think as a architect, landscape architect, you're trained. One of the first things you learn in architecture school is representation. It's one of the first courses you take in school. And so this idea of representation and representing land as a way of conveying power, I think, is really important. And so if abstracting land as a property grid conveys a sort of colonial power, then abstracting land in other ways, like the way that Bonnie has done in her art, it conveys a different kind of power. And I think that, I don't know, art historically speaking, like if representation can colonize, then maybe representation can decolonize. And actually, as you were presenting your work, Bonnie, I actually jotted down, like, can I call these counter cartographies? And I was like, would Bonnie be insulted if I called her work mapping? Because she's, critiquing mapping in a way. And yeah, and so I think that this is mobilizing representation as a tool can be quite powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think that this question that you bring up about the power of art, and I like the way you frame that art is a different kind of power. I think there's something incredibly important there. And Bonnie, in response to what you were talking about too, I can't help but actually go back to Patrick's last slide there, and something that I'm interested in my own work right now, especially, is the sacredness of it, right? And I think at the core of the two things, there might be a difference in how we think of things from a sacred perspective, or again, the commodity that you both have brought up. So I think that there's parts of that that's involved there. Patrick, yeah, I see your hand.
Can I just quickly have a response too? Just in terms of, when you talk about psychogeography, the effect, I'm thinking of the surveying of the reserves and the effect that had on people, right? It was a demarked location that you weren't allowed to leave initially. You had to have a pass and to come back, all that kind of stuff. So it was a very much a guarded place, and that has effects on people. And often the reserves were not the best property. It was the best property for the colonizers to push people onto and leave them, with the better properties. So, that has an effect, and that continues to have effect. You know, Montreal Lake Cree Nation, you know, 75% of the people in the community have to have truck water because the water where the reserve is lousy. You know, it continues to affect us. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, there's something I'll just add, given Bonnie's from close to where I am right now, you know, the psychogeography that I was, the first time we came here, I don't know if you know an elder named Hilda Najuan. She's from Sudbury anyways. She told my first year students a creation story about Sudbury, and she talked about the serpent that goes underneath the city between the two lakes. And then she told us all about the Star Woman. And so I think like what's powerful in your art, in this idea of the power of art, is I can't look at this city, I can't understand this place the same anymore after I heard those stories, right? So you really do, there's a filter of stories in the land that teach you about the place where you are if you're listening to them. So, which is very different than like the kind of grid condition. Adrian, I'm just going to follow up then with my second question, then I'll pass it on to you. I think Patrick, in kind of response to this conversation, you know, the Dave Toronto project, I think it exhibits some of your work in a sense that, like you've written about in our interview in the issue, is that the architect and the city dweller, let's say, or the reserve dweller, as you just said, is forced to navigate between these lines, and some of your work, like that project, I think it's a resistance. It's a resistance against those lines, in a sense. What you said about the child-based. So I guess my question to you, based on this kind of question about the art, is, you know, can you talk about the hegemony of property and how it impacts Indigenous agency, and where is that space we find to confront it? I mean, I think we just highlighted one from art as a powerful way to retell that story, you know, and I think you're trying to do it in your work. You know, you've worked a lot in homelessness, but where is the Indigenous agency that can work within these boundaries?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that I talked about in my presentation was the Angosk, which is our traditional territory, and that is a territory that's held for everyone in our WILP, in our house. So there isn't per se individual lots that are part of that. The colonizers, when they came, they did survey the Angosk and laid it out. And so that is there as a layer, but we look beyond it and say, well, okay, that's them, that's what they've got there. But we think of our own land, you know, in our nation, it's from mountaintop to mountaintop, headwaters to the ocean. That's our land, not all these individual little lots. And so when we're talking and doing our own business in the nation, we're talking at that level, and it's not at that commodified little 25-foot by 50-foot lot or whatever that they've surveyed out, right? So when you come to the city, you're crunching up against that. I mean, that project, the Children's Village, was a bit of a struggle because the city didn't want it, and you know, and I was bound and determined to do it because my thinking is, well, when they came, they burned down our villages, they cut our totem poles down, they floated them away, put them in museums around the world, and you know, gave us a colonial settlement. And what I did with the Children's Village is I said, okay, well, you took it all away from us. I'm putting it on the street. I'm putting it in your face. You took our way of villages with violence. I'm going to violently put it back. And you know, that's what I tend to do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Adrian.
Thanks for these thoughts and answers. I was thinking in this discussion about psychogeography that architecture is a drug for introverts to dominate the land or something, this kind of fantasy of delineation. So Patrick, as you know, David and I have found your intervention into the word Canada to be a beautifully concise statement about the logic of spatial production in this land over the past 500 years. We've already described it, and you've described it really well. Tiffany, your examination of the violence, not only of extraction industries, but also of so-called natural conservation in the form of parks, illustrates the precise spatial grammar of Patrick's linguistic move. Bonnie, your juxtaposition of paintings of whole and undivided land and the segmentation of colonial maps of Southern Ontario creates two contrasting images of space that are visual analogs of the grammatical operation that Patrick performed in his PhD dissertation, which eschewed punctuation to privilege the unbroken flow of speech, except when grappling with explicitly colonial concepts like C-A-N-A-D-A. The central question we're interested in exploring within the journal issue is how the violence of colonial dispossession, which was initiated through architecturally imaginative exercise of spatial delineation in advance of the landscape, architectural, and infrastructural constructions that followed, is the fundamental spatial framework of our contemporary urban and rural spaces. Because of this, each of our urban and rural spaces are haunted by this original dispossession, and the pathologies of contemporary urban space are all problems that can be traced back to it. I'm wondering if each of you could speak to the ways in which you see the fragmentation of land that we inhabit together as the foundation not only of serious problems for Indigenous peoples, but also the ground of trauma and unhappiness for people who settled here, came as refugees, or were brought here against their will.
Who wants to go first? A current example I have is some work that I'm doing in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And we are trying to respect the Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam peoples that, whose land Vancouver is founded on. And it is a constant reminder to those people of those nations what they're faced with every day they wake up on that land that traditionally was where they lived. And they created a park called Stanley Park in Vancouver, and they kicked all the Indigenous people off. And sure, they made some concessions and said, well, if you were living there, we'll let you die there, but nobody else can move there. They had those kind of ideas. And then they created a reserve across the water where they relocated the community. And what they can do is they can look back at the land that they used to live on, and know that there was armed relocation. So they were violently relocated to that new property, and you can see it in the city. We have downtown east side is the, what do they say, the poorest zip code in the country. And poverty is rampant, homelessness is rampant. There's 2,000 people homeless at any one time in Vancouver. And you think of a rich country like Canada, why do we have homelessness, right? It's a big issue. People are dispossessed all the time. And I'll shut up now.
I guess I'll speak now. I'm interested in Adrian, when you said that I was the images that I was juxtaposing with the maps, with the grid marks on the maps was unbroken. And I guess I would say it's more complicated than that, because the land that I imagine, and I think that Indigenous people recognize, is not only unbroken, it is interwoven, it is braided, it is enmeshed with powers, forces, beings. You had spoken about the spiritual value of these images, David, as well. And of course, those forces are also interwoven in that land. And so it's not only unbroken, it's more powerful and potent than we can possibly imagine. I love the image that you raised, David, about the serpent in the Sudbury region. This is close to where I come from originally, and of course I come from Serpent River. This is a hugely powerful image for us, and it speaks not of fantasy, but of knowing. You know, there is not, and I think that this is really a one of the difficulties that we have with Canada, because Patrick, you speak of a kind of terrorism that has occurred on the land and that continues to harm us in our ability to collect ourselves as nations and to actually assert the healing that we want and the reconstitution of our nations that we require. But the reality is that the terror that is coming will, like, it's already happened to us. Like, we're post-apocalyptic survivors. So we're ready for what's coming, but I don't think that the rest of Canada actually is. And I think that this is the unsettling prospect that animates most of my work, is the idea that the land will ultimately prevail here, whether you or I survive it. And this is deep, deep knowledge in my people, and I would suspect in yours too, Patrick. We are not fearful of that. The living conditions that we endure right now are predations that eventually will be meaningless in the face of what is coming, I think, in coming decades. And so what am I saying here? I just believe that art is an attempt to teach about that. And architecture's role in that, I do not know. I do not understand. And I would be delighted to know how architecture and landscape architecture and all the theorizing and all of the practical applications of that are grappling with that knowledge, because I do not see it. And what I see is that the work that Patrick is doing and the work that artists of Indigenous ancestry are doing is grappling with that.
I have to say, Adrian, I'm not quite sure I understood your question, but I just want to, I guess I can bring in like the history of like urbanism and urban theory, which is completely grounded in the fragmenting of land, and it's impossible to separate these two things. I mean, it expresses itself in urban spaces, in like urban redlining and sort of racial segregation, which was sort of prevalent throughout the Americas. And then you can see extreme sort of segregation today in the form of our Canada's current extreme housing crisis, the sort of divisions there. And then it was also reflecting on divisions caused by histories of urban development. So I'm thinking, I've been doing some work recently, or I've been thinking recently about the 2013 flood in Calgary, and how actually the flooding of the city actually stems directly from sort of history of poor urban planning and damming of rivers upstream in the mountains, and how that had a very disruptive effect on the urban fabric of downtown Calgary specifically. And so I think these are some instances that I can maybe recall.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, Bonnie, and Patrick. I think we have only a few minutes remaining, but we should open up if there are any questions from audience members, I think. Catherine, do you want to lead that?
Hey, thank you to all the roundtable participants for your presentation. We're now ready to take questions, and here is how it works. For the public, if you would like to ask a question, please use your Q&A, the Q&A function on Zoom, not the raise hand function, because we cannot see it in our group, and not the chat. And as soon as we receive the questions, I will read them out loud. And we actually have one question already. This is a question from Derek, and I'm reading it. David Fortin, in a Canadian Art article on May 24, 2018, you stated that, and Derek quotes, Indigenous architecture cannot be stylized. You cannot just look at a pattern and then try to replicate it. Because if you are not part of the story in meaningful ways, you cannot do that. End of quote. Can you please say more about how this living tradition will influence architecture in the near future? Is the Whitefish Lake First Nation project a first important step? What others are in development? So David, this is for you.
Thank you for the question, Derek. I think my short answer to this is something that over the last number of years I'm myself grappling with, which is to rethink about what we think design of buildings are. That they, I think there's, for many generations of architects, the focus was on the object, and the visuality of the object, or the phenomenology of design. So how design makes someone feel. They're both very human-centric. They are both objectified positions, and they're both antithetical to some of the things that we've talked about here today. So that quote that you just offered is really about buildings. I'm thinking of them more and more as living organisms, right? And if they're living organisms, that includes the entire network, the ecological network around them, the entire social network around them, and that they have stories. And each building has a story that predates the architect and outlives the architect. In fact, the architect is only part of that story for a very short time period. So if you kind of break away from the idea of focusing on the aesthetics of things, we get wrapped up in a preoccupation of what things look like, and whether they're, the money shot is good enough for the magazine and those other things. And that's part of the culture of architecture. And I'm not saying I think that's useless. I think that that's all valuable, and I love design. But if it's not framed from a position of understanding those social and ecological networks, you're kind of missing the point. And I think architecture has missed the point largely for a lot of years. So that's sort of what I'm aspiring to. Whitefish Lake is one example of that, but it's sort of becoming more and more apparent in all of our work that if we don't hit it at all of those other levels, that we're not pushing ourselves as architects to be more ethical in how we operate, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. We have another question. I'm reading the question. Can the mapping of customs, rituals, and festivals be another way that places are understood as intangible connections to cosmologies, sacred understandings, and the life of communities? Can these supersede the idea of a static architecture reduced to form? I imagine this question is open to all the architects in the panel. Adrian, you want to say something? I see you moving.
I was just thinking maybe artists too. I don't know, given that Bonnie, you
Yeah.
You said maybe counter mapping wasn't the wrong thing to call your work. But.
Well, I'll jump in because I certainly do believe that the mapping of, I think the list of things was festivals, gatherings, public collections of people and so on. Can those supersede form? And absolutely, of course they can. In fact, I would say they're the most important thing. I go back to what David said about perhaps missing the point if architecture is only about style and form, because surely it is about creating volumes for people to gather in. And I would say that to expand that idea into the idea of place is absolutely what mapping is about. So how do we define where we are and where we lived, who we are, and what people we belong to? It depends on the waterways around us, how we got here, the shores and the mountains that bind us in that place, and the history of gatherings that occurred in that place. That is the essence of place. And to acknowledge that, I mean, these land acknowledgements, they become empty phrases. But really what we're trying, I think, to talk about is, why are we here? What do we do here? What have we been doing here for millennia? And what does that mean to us in our roots, in our blood? And so, yeah, I absolutely think that supersedes form. That's the ultimate abstraction to me.
I would like to add, good answer, Bonnie, that the structural or the physical form is really nothing without, for me, without Indigenous knowledge informing that form, right? So that's one of the things that my work relies on, and it is, it can't be nothing without it.
Thank you, and maybe we will have time for one last question, which I am about to read. And here it goes. David and Patrick both brought up the notion of the sacred. I am curious to hear more about the role of the sacred in the specific possibilities of architecture in overcoming colonial violence. So, David and Patrick.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this and give again. I don't know how you can do these ones short answers, but this is central to what I'm thinking about these days. Actually, there's a quote by that I use a lot in my public talks from the former dean of forestry at Yale, Gus Speth, and he talks about how he used to think that the climate change was a result of all the kind of scientific problems that we have, and then at the end he says, but he's realized that it's actually that we need a spiritual and cultural overhaul or shift, and that we scientists don't know how to do that. And I think that we could substitute architects into that as well. And it's a deep, long, tangled history of really removing questions of spirituality from the academy. Is part of it, and also the removal of the subject. That. So if you think about, you write in the third person all the time. You have to write as if you don't have a voice in academic protocols. There's a whole bunch of a network here to kind of despiritualize our relationship to space. And I think that if we don't view the planet as sacred, everybody can talk about LEED checklists and being sustainable, but when you're talking about the foundational problems, if it's not coming from a place of a spiritual aspiration to do better, I think it becomes empty. So I think it's crucial, and I think it's going to become more crucial, actually, in response to what Bonnie said. I think that in the coming decades, we're going to have to reposition ourselves, or we're all collectively in a lot of trouble.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Matthew, for that question. it's a good one. One of the things that I've been working with and thinking about beyond, I guess, what I had just said about the use of Indigenous knowledge, which is foundational for me, is that concept of two-eyed seeing. So you have both in Indigenous and then you have Western, and using both, you end up having to use both perspectives in projects in a modern world. But like I mentioned in my presentation, it all has to be the land that we're from, for sure. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to thank our roundtable participants for their exchanges, the exchanges they have offered to us. We are coming to the end of this conversation, and I also want to thank, of course, the public for being here with us. I also extend my thanks to Derek Knight, David Vivian, Gillian Winokur, Sean Mercer, Gilgun Doran, and Sarah Fisher at the Marilyn Iwalk School of Fine and Performing Arts, and to Bernard Cella at the Salon für Artists Books. This event is generously funded through a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and matching funds from the Office of the Vice President Research at Brock University. So we are coming to a close of this roundtable. Thank you to everyone. Guten Abend aus Wien. Good evening from Vienna. Papa, for the participants, we're meeting in our own panelist group.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, Bonnie, and Patrick.